Let's go live now to Joe Siracusa, who's in Melbourne, Australia. He's an inaugural professor of global futures at Curtin University. Welcome back, Joe. Donald Trump, he was the man who pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Do you think that he's not openly saying it, but do you think he's completely behind Israel on this conflict that they've brought in against Iran?
Good morning, Neil. Well, yeah, he's behind the conflict. I'm sure his people have been involved in this from the get-go, as a matter of fact. But he's also desperate to broker some kind of an arrangement. Now, look, in my long study of diplomacy, I know that no war was ever averted without diplomacy, and no war was ever concluded without diplomacy, or the art of diplomacy. And I think President Trump, and particularly, there'd be pressure around him to bring this to a conclusion. Now, your earlier package suggested this thing's going to burn itself out. Well, by the time that happens, tens of thousands of people may die from these missile attacks. I think within a very short period of time, the Iranians will look at the cards that they're playing. And, they're not saying that they want nuclear weapons. What they're saying is that they're prepared to fight for the right to enrich uranium. Well, people aren't going to go to war too long for that kind of a thing. So I think the Iranians will be looking for some kind of brokered deal. I think President Trump, and I think the Gulf states, I think Saudi Arabia, and even Russia's been on the phone, and Putin's been on the phone to Trump to see how we can make this thing come to a conclusion. And I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later because, the Iranians will get their truce or ceasefire, whatever it is. They'll get the sanctions off their back. And, the irony here is, Neil, all Trump's going to do is get the same deal that Obama had, but except he's going to be able to put his name on it. It isn't going to be much better or much worse, be about the same thing. But this time, it will stop a great deal of these hostilities. And this is a war. The United States technically involved with the Iranians, but 9 million Israelis are not going to occupy a nation of 92 million people. It doesn't work that way. So I think the Israelis would be wise to follow President Trump's lead here. And of course, Trump wants to be the center of attention here. He wants to be able to be the honest broker. I mean, that's never technically going to happen because he's not an honest broker. He's too much on Israel's side. But I think if he can broker a peace settlement and come up with a deal at the end of the day, he'll be very satisfied. And, this guy is obsessed with averting conflict. That is, he's risk averse, and he wants to be a peacemaker and remembered for these things. And, Neil, he was elected because he was going to avoid the next forever war in the Middle East. So, he's got a lot at stake here, and particularly with the 2026 midterm elections coming up and his vice president's future, depending on what Trump does this time around, diplomacy is going to matter a great deal.
Are we in a cycle here? Is this just something that we're going to see repeating again and again and again, where Iran gets beaten down and sanctions put on it and it's forced to submit that it's not going to enrich uranium, and then somewhere down the line there'll be reports that it is enriching uranium to a higher degree than people are comfortable with?
Yeah, it does feel a lot like that movie Sliding Doors, where you keep coming back to the same scene over and over again with slightly different conclusions. Yeah, it might be. I mean, I don't think the Iranians are really too crazy about developing a nuclear weapon while they're under attack and they have no control over the skies. I mean, they're just sitting ducks right now for the Israeli Air Force. Yeah, I think they might come back to it, but for the time being, they're on record. Their foreign minister's on record swearing off nuclear weapons, and though they do reserve the right to have the enrichment. And I think it's about time to bring this craziness to a conclusion so we can get to the real problem. And the real problem for me is, as you know, in the last 3 years, is trying to stop the war in Gaza. And now the Gaza is now on the back burner until we solve this problem. So this problem is just crying for a solution.
As you mentioned there, Iran's kind of sitting ducks at the mercy of the Israeli Air Force. Are you surprised the way that Israel is just being allowed to start conflicts, Lebanon, Gaza, now Iran, and there's really no intervention coming globally?
Well, I mean, there have been complaints in Europe and some other places. There are members of the United Nations Security Council who know that this is a mistake. Look, I think Israel has rewritten its own rules as we go along here. They think they're fighting to the death, and so do the Iranians, as a matter of fact. And in this last 3 years, they've hammered Hamas, they've hammered Hezbollah and the militias in Iraq. They've come to terms with, I mean, the Americans have come to terms with Syria. So, Israel has one less enemy in that neck of the woods. Yeah, I mean, they're kind of making the rules up as they go along. I mean, that's what they call it in political science, revisionism. If you don't like the rules, make up some new rules. And, Israelis seem to have their own justification. But I do notice that on the day that Netanyahu began this barrage, I think his government was just about ready to collapse. And he's still looking at a jail sentence. So, this guy's running for his life. And I don't want to be cynical enough to believe that he's starting a war with a proper war with Iran in order to avoid a jail sentence or a collapse of his government. I mean, that would just be too cynical to imagine. But yeah, I think Israel's kind of making up the rules the way the Americans did in the 19th century. We broke all the rules when we took California, Texas, Arizona, and Colorado from Mexico and said goodbye. I mean, it just seems to me that if you got the power, you can make up the rules as you go along. But sooner or later, you got to come back to the negotiating table. The Israelis can't fight forever. They don't have ammunition forever. And sooner or later, the American people will say, look, enough is enough.
We've talked about the fact that Iran doesn't have great capability to defend itself, but what it does reportedly have is an awful lot of missiles and drones. So in theory, if it does decide to go all out against Israel, is it capable of inflicting quite a lot of damage?
Enormous damage. I mean, the Israeli ambassador to the UN said on American television Sunday morning that 15% of the Iranian missiles are getting through. Last October, 40% of the Iranian missiles came through. And this Iron Dome only works so far, can only intercept so much, and you could overwhelm any air defense system. They only go to a certain point, and then you're on your own after that. Yeah, they can do enormous damage. In fact, some people say that if the Iranians have the stomach for it, if they want to take the losses, they could wreak lifetime damage on the Israeli nation. But I don't know if they want to go that far, because at the end of the day, the leadership of Iran wants to be there on Monday morning. They don't want to give the game away just to wreak havoc in Israel. They want to be there to be able to play the game. So, sooner or later, nations see that they have to do certain things. I mean, I know there's all this talk about striking U.S. assets and closing the Strait of Hormuz, and nothing would be further from the interest of the Iranian people than starting a war with the United States. Because once the United States gets in a war like this, they just don't know when to quit.
Joe, some fascinating insights. I appreciate them. My guest, Joe Siracusa, Professor of Global Futures at Curtin University.